Good evening, Vanessa. No, I can't break brand. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Dom. What a good eventide to you.
Doing uncertain things, which thank you for joining us on a Wednesday. It's like one of the uncertain things is what day will our episode air on?
What day will I get a vaccine appointment? Which is now a certain thing. It went from being uncertain last night as I was like painfully refreshing pages until like 2 a.m, which you know for me is very, very un-Vanessa-like hours. But I think I got an appointment today.
Congratulations. May your side effects be nominal. Today, we happily have Batya Ungar-Sargon, who's the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek and formerly the opinion editor at The Forward. And she is soon to release her new book, which is Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. And as I think I've been preparing you, dear listener, through the past 2 episodes, this conversation will be the coda to our pseudo-trilogy about why everything is so miserable in the political realm right now, in the political discourse.
Is that only a trilogy, though, to be fair?
Yes, some might argue that it's the entire theme of the podcast, but we did like these 3 back-to-back conversations that we recorded, and we appreciated them for their thematic coherence, or at least what we saw as thematic coherence. It started with Caitlin Flanagan talking about the cultural underpinnings, then moving to conservative commentator Yuval Levine, giving us the institutional background, and now to Batya to talk about the Marxist perspective.
But, you know, because of our own obsessions, we couldn't help but bring media into every single episode of these. So that's also a through line.
Yes.
And to the extent to which the media is to blame across all of these dimensions.
And in fairness, that's also the theme of Batya's book.
Yes.
Which is funny because a lot of the criticism that she brings up in her articles, which we obviously recommend reading, is directed at this old liberal academic concept of false consciousness, which is a Frankfurt School idea, decades old, trying to explain why is it that the working class just doesn't seem to vote left. And the way that the leftist elite tended to explain it was the workers are brainwashed by the media to vote against their interest. Problem solved. So obviously, Batya hates this and calls out bullshit, but it's just, there's something amusing that Batya and also myself, to the extent that I agree with her, tend to focus so much on the media from the other perspective. It's just a hobby horse in, I think, American discourse to focus so much on the media and on how the media manufactures the political consciousness of the public. And here we are about to do it again. So we're going to talk about Batya's criticism that the discourse, especially, is guided by the media elites, has supplanted identity politics for real class consciousness. And as a result, and according to Batya, by design, the discourse ignores the people who are really hurt under our current social system, not least of whom are people of color, and exactly those people the left claims to defend. So obviously there was a lot we agreed on, and there was a lot we disagreed on. And I funnily enough, of all the things that I pushed back on, I didn't push back much on the Marxism angle. And I guess that's for next time, Batya.
Yeah, and we also have to bring her back to talk about, Shakespeare. So that's we've got to unpack that little nugget. If you get all the way to the end, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Absolutely, but she is wonderful, and it was an incredibly fun and I think exceedingly inebriated conversation, at least by yours truly. But really, it was a fun, weird, free-flowing debate.
Yeah, she was super, super nice. Really game to just talk about whatever we threw at her. It would definitely have her back again to talk some more.
Also, trigger warning, she was quite Jewish. So if that's an angle that bothers you about this podcast. Once Vanessa asked me, is our podcast Jewish? Does it reek of the Jew?
There's a very specific context for that question that you're completely taking out of at the moment.
We have to leave it there, Vanessa. We have to leave it there.
You're totally editing this out, and everyone's going to be very confused about my perceptions of our identity and my relationship to Jewishness, which I guess I'm pretty confused about too.
Spoken like a true anti-Semite. Well, with that.
Wait, don't we have to tell people to listen to us or follow us
yes.
on the social medias?
Follow us on uncertain.substack.com.
Yeah, whatever your identity or religion.
But however you identify, it will be really nice if you could give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. And we are Uncertain Pod on Twitter and Instagram if you feel like having some online arguments and adding to the muck of toxic online discourse. We'll be there. And with that...
Batya. Adam mostly started reaching out to people that he knew and followed and just was of the kind of ilk of people that don't fall into like left or right, but are kind of more free thinking people that can see the merits and disadvantages of both types of thinking.
Except that, let's be honest, free thinking is just code word for alt-right nowadays, so...
I'm so glad you said it. I was thinking it, but no, I was listening to the interview you did with Katie Herzog, and when she was talking about like her moment, I think a lot of us have our moment where we realize we weren't in the camp that we thought we were in, or that the camp that we thought we were in would no longer have us. Like that kind of devastating.
Yeah, it's something that. Hey, Batya.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome to
it. Feels like every person who's of a certain age who works in the media at some point reaches a similar apprehension. I'm really not comfortable with some of the things that are happening in my industry right now. I feel like it clashes or is in friction with the ideas that I had of what a journalist is supposed to do and what it means to actually have an open conversation and an open debate. Here's an example. The other day I was watching The Wire for the first time. I've postponed it for long enough.
Oh, no spoilers, Adam. I'm also watching.
Wait, are you guys watching it together? You're roommates, right?
He like sped ahead of me, so I'm still on season 2.
Oh, the betrayal.
I know.
Season 5 is about the media, and there's a guy there who's supposed to represent the ethical journalist. You have the sleazy editor-in-chief, you have the suck-up, and then you have the guy who's supposed to be the ethical guy. And his name is Augustus, which is a great name. And so there's just one moment where he says... A real newsroom is one where people are constantly arguing and shouting at each other. And it's just that seems quaint now. Seems like there's a push against that. And for people raised on heuristic tendencies and the dialectic, this feels a little icky. So, going to you, Batya.
Into that ickiness where we bring our guests.
I'm writing a book. I have written a book about that ickiness, but I failed to use the word icky in the title, and now I feel that I need to rethink all my life choices because that's exactly what it is. It's gross. I mean, what's happened to our industry is gross. And I concur. I feel very much in agreement with you that we have, to a large extent, that the media, and especially, I don't want to say especially the liberal media, except that the left has such a stranglehold on culture right now. But has abandoned very much the mandate of journalism. From my point of view, you see a lot of it in the conversation and the moral panic around race. But to my mind, what that's really doing is obscuring a more important conversation about class. And a lot of the mainstreaming of a woke culture war is about white, liberal, affluent elites maintaining power, maintaining money. So we can get into that. But that is just a summary to say, I really agree with you. There's an ick factor. And it's not just an ick factor. It's not just aesthetically disgusting, but it's a disaster for our democracy. And we have to fix it. And so I thank you for leaning into the ick. And
also hence the title of your book, right?
Yeah, it's called Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. you could see how it could have so benefited from the word ick. I mean, it's just like such a huge.
It could have just come at the beginning. Ick! Exclamation point. Bad news.
And well, get into all of this we shall, but first, tell us about yourself. Give us the elevator bio.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, I'm the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek. We are, I believe at this point, the only publication left that is still publishing the full spectrum of legitimate opinion, from left to right. I don't know anyone else who's doing it. The New York Times has certainly given up. Don't see the right-wing publications doing that. And so I work for a very conservative guy, Josh Hammer, who's wonderful and truly believes in debate. And they brought me on to sort of beef up the lefty liberal side. I still consider myself to be a lefty, even though the left does not want me anymore. Too bad. And I've been trying to elevate the voices of working class Americans who have been completely deplatformed because, spoiler alert, they tend to be conservative. And we can get into that later, why that is. But throughout history, I mean, the left has been sort of run the gamut of disappointment to disgust at the working class's conservatism and unwillingness to follow them to revolution. So trying to beef up
those stupid working class ignoramuses keep voting against their own interest.
Exactly. And I really reject that point of view. As a religious person, I feel that, the least among us has the most to teach us. And you really just do not see that. I mean, one of the things that's happened is, through the wokeification of the mainstream media, mainstream liberal media, is that the right point of view has become increasingly narrow and is always changing and is determined by a very tiny elite that wields its power enormously, but through horrible platforms like Twitter. So you end up having, the vast majority of Americans deplatformed, if you, the code changes from day to day, which is part of how they maintain their power, right? Like if the code were stable, people could be like, okay, I know I'm only allowed to say these 3 things out of the 100 things that I might think about this, but at least I know what to avoid saying. But because it changes every day and because it's not tied to morality at all, but to power, they maintain that power, this kind of Twitterati. And of course, again, like as religious people, as Jews, like, we don't believe that a person's inherent worth has to do with power or where they rank or anything immutable about them. We're all created in God's image. I'm sorry if this is getting too... but we believe that a person's that human life is infinitely inherently valuable, and that we have a common humanity that we must always call back on, and that we are all created equal before God and must be made equal before the law. And it is that view that's increasingly falling by the wayside and becoming itself. If they compare it to all, we'll get into it, but gets compared, just believing that now gets compared to like the genocide.
So call back to our Tomer Persico episode, Adam, because we had a whole episode with a religious scholar who, it was all about the image of God. So it's interesting that we're kind of bringing that back. But sorry, to your question.
That was our launching episode. I want to get into, we kind of alluded to that in the beginning of the conversation, that journalists of our, I guess, age, upbringing, and moral affinities found ourselves at some point in the past decade really starting to question where they are and where they belong in the bigger conversation. I wonder, what was the moment for you of realizing you were moving away from your natural camp, or vice versa?
Okay. It was like in stages and then all at once. So before I was at Newsweek, I was at The Forward, which is the largest Jewish newspaper in America. And basically, I felt that I had the same mandate to sort of run opinions across the gamut of legitimate opinion. And at first, because I'm a kind of known lefty, the left was very excited that I had gotten this job. And then I started running, conservatives, because I told The Forward when they were hiring me, I'm not running an opinion section when I can't run conservatives. There's no point. And suddenly I noticed like even people who I thought were friends, you start seeing them kind of denouncing you publicly. And it was very shocking. I had never kind of had that before.
Do you remember a specific example?
One of the first things I did when I got to the forward was I had like, I think 5 Black Jews writing regularly for me. And I made a Palestinian a columnist, this Palestinian guy from Gaza, the most amazing guy, Mohammed Chihada, just a wonderful person. Then I think I ran a settler. Now, before I would run a settler, just like before I would run, somebody on the far left, I called him on the phone and said, all right, let's talk. I'm not platforming someone who doesn't think Palestinians should have civil rights. So let's talk. What does the end goal look like to you? One always wants to say final solution, and then one self-correct. We talked today. You said to me, no, why? Everyone should have civil rights. I'm not worried about, forget about that. No, give them all rights tomorrow. I don't care. We have room for them. Great. So, I ran him, and then, all hell broke loose. And I was like, so shocking. Like, I ran like 5 anti-Zionists last week, it's like one settler who's saying, hey, we have a different idea about, I think it was about coexistence, and, we're the ones actually living with Palestinians. Like, here's what I've learned from my experience, something like that. And I remember being surprised, like, we're clearly tilted to the left because the Jewish community is tilted to the left. And it's part of my view that the opinion section should reflect, the community. We're so tilted in your direction. Like you're going to hold this one piece against me.
What kind of comments were you receiving?
That's the thing. It's like you would think that a friend would reach out on WhatsApp and be like, hey, why'd you run that? Walk me through your decision. Of course, by the way, my Palestinian friends were all like, it's great to see you doing this. Like, that's how you get him to read me when I write for you. Like, they all totally supported it, and you see this a lot. It's like the anti-Zionist Jews are like more verbrent, it's like a Yiddish word, whatever. They're like more extremist than like this Palestinian guy who's actually living, one of my closest friends, actually living under occupation in Hebron, like he's the guy saying to me, go, you know what I mean? Do it. This is how you do it. This is how you, and because of course I wouldn't do it without his blessing. Meanwhile, they're out there like denouncing it. It's just so funny. It's always like that, So, but then it really blew up. Around anti-Semitism. So when I started at the Forward, the dividing line in the Jewish community between like far left or, left and liberal was over BDS. The boycott against Israel. Of course, we ran people supporting it, people opposing it, across the gamut. By the time I left, the dividing line was whether or not you're allowed to call out anti-Semitism on the left. And if you think that that's important and a value, and that the left is worthless unless it too is committed to fighting anti-Semitism, that became the line at which that was no longer acceptable. So you saw this around Congresswoman Ilhan Omar when she made those comments. You saw this around the Women's March. You saw it around a lot.
Linda Sarsour. And then when Orthodox Jews were getting assaulted almost daily in Brooklyn in 2019, the vast majority, according to the police, 3/4 of the assaults were committed by young Black teenagers. And if you called that, if you said anything except, oh look, Trump is anti-Semitism is on the rise from all these Trump supporters, you became the enemy, and that happened to me. And I wonder a lot, like, oh, if people who I had considered friends, who I had, given my platform to, who I tried to elevate, hadn't turned on me publicly, denounced me, like, would I have come to this position? It's like a very hard thing to ask yourself, like. And they called you out as what? They
racist,
an actual racist,
every day, racist, Islamophobic. You hate, And people who work for publications where there isn't a single person of color, you know what I mean? It's like I'm literally still to this day, I run more Black, brown, Muslim voices than I do white ones. not that I don't think that is, I'm trying to get past seeing that as it's very woke to think that way, like, to rely on those immutable characteristics. But of course, it's important to platform the voices of the disenfranchised. And you can literally spend your life trying to do that and then get called a racist by. So I became like, I was, they tried to cancel me a bunch of times, and it gave me a point, like, it was really, I think about this a lot, but I think it really came down to, like, how can you ask me to not talk about anti-Semitism on my own side? I have no power on the right. I can call out Steve King, but no one's going to take away Steve King's committee appointments because of something Batya Ungar-Sargon said. Like, I don't have any cachet with those people. I have cachet here, so, like, I'm going to call it out on that side because it's disgusting and that's what we do. But I have no power to make change there. I have power here, and I'm going to use it to fight all forms of bigotry, like the most important mandate, to fight for it.
That's a really good point. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before, about the kind of responsibility that you hold when you supposedly represent a side. I really like the way that you kind of clarified that, because of course, like, we can all like rail about what Trump did and said until we're blue in the face, but it's more of a responsibility to talk about the people we admire potentially.
And you think that this is an intuition that belongs to the left, or that the left is at least very familiar with. I remember, as it might come as a shock to our listeners, but I'm Israeli. But I remember a lot of the arguments that we would have. It's a very familiar argument in Israel, where you hear people on the right saying, what about Syria? What about Iran? What about Hamas in Gaza? They violate human rights left and right. Why are you so obsessed with the occupation? And then the sensible response on the left usually is, let them deal with their own crap, but that does not justify any human rights violation that happens on your watch. You first of all deal with what's happening in your house. Yeah, these are real human rights problems, but you're not fixing it, and you're not responsible for what Hamas does. You are responsible for what you do and what restrictions you put on Palestinians. It's such an obvious, familiar, liberal argument. It's the Chomskyite argument. Don't take the high ground and point at all the despots around the world, as long as your own country is committing human rights violations and is involved in imperialistic foreign policy. And suddenly, when you're flipping this argument internally and asking the left to do some introspection about how it allows a whole underclass of society go underserved and ignored, then you get this backlash, and you come against this glaring blind spot.
I mean, but I think what's interesting about what Batya was saying is not just that, what you're saying, Adam, about the blind spot, but the fact that she wields more power to affect change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
It's all part of that. So what changed? How did we get from what we took for granted in the past as a liberal intuition to where we are now?
Okay, it happened for a number of reasons. Let's take the New York Times. Okay, so first of all, there was a generational turnover in a very small amount of time. So there was like about 100 people took buyouts in 2008, I believe it was. Okay, so you lost 100 journalists, and then what they did was they brought in people who were not journalists, who were not reporters and editors, but who were sort of ancillary figures, people to do audio, people to do video, people to work on the product, people to work on the user experience. Now, all these people are in Slack channels with the journalists, and a lot of them, they made a concerted effort, which was good, to hire people of color. About 40% of the new hires were people of color. But who does the New York Times hire, right? I mean, to be a journalist today, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, journalism was a blue-collar job. It was a job that you did not need a high school diploma for, you did not need a college degree for, and only a third of journalists, in 1931 had a college degree. Even before that, you had folks like Joseph Pulitzer and Benjamin Day, the guy who started the penny press. And for them, it was very clear that journalism, the point of journalism was to be for the working class and by the working class. That was the point. It was a crusade on behalf of the poor and the working class. And they came up at a time when the press was very partisan. Partisan press is not a problem. The problem with our press today is not that it's partisan. It's that it's partisan on behalf of the elites, that it's partisan on behalf of the top 15% of the country, right? The professional class. And it's so funny to me because you have just small digression, but, you have like, the conservative press, and then you have the liberal press. You have Nancy Pelosi and you have Mitch McConnell, right? And it looks like they're having this big fight. Trickle down economics, versus welfare state, a stronger welfare state. Neither of those are pro working class policies, right? It looks like a debate, but it's actually not, because obviously, like trickle down economics is not going to help the working class. But a welfare state is not about the working class either, right? It's about taking away the independence of the laboring class and creating people who live and exist at the beneficence of the government and the liberals who give them this beneficence, right? So you have these sort of tax, you have these tech moguls, right? And they're happy to pay tons and tons. They tell me what tax bracket you want because they're gazillionaires. You'll never actually impact their wealth. They just want to keep being able to amass wealth, right? And they just tell me what tax bracket I have to pay, right? And they'll create, like you said, a permanent underclass who lives, who gets a universal basic income, right? But has no autonomy because they are living at the beneficence of this kind of elite, right? So what we have is a government and a press that is completely devoted to the top 15%. And what happens is every 4 years, we decide which 7% of the top 15% gets to have their way. And so, I'm sorry, it was a huge digression. Should I get back to the press? Or
let's hold it first for a second. Yeah. I'll digress on the digression. Vanessa and I had a discussion yesterday about finances because part of my working class inhibitions is that only now at my ripe age did I actually start investing. I used to, and well, to a large extent still am, guided by the working class idea that I need to keep my money where I can see it.
Right, in the mattress.
In the mattress, yeah, exactly.
Where it belongs.
And now I went through the journey. I am a changed man because today I bought one stock, like literally a single stock.
So,
yeah. And Vanessa and I were talking yesterday, and she was briefing me about how to conduct my business, and
just like my limited knowledge of what is an IRA. That's basically what the wisdom I was bestowing: a Roth IRA versus an IRA.
And I remember thinking about that millennial cliche, like it's a disgrace that they spent our time in high school teaching us history instead of finance. And I always resented that idea because, hey, A, why are you hating on history? And B, finance is black magic. But obviously it is a crucial piece of knowledge for people to have. And it's crazy that so many of us grow up without having a shred of understanding. And it just occurred to me that the GameStop story showed you how destabilizing it really is when finance actually gets democratized and the great unwashed masses get to invest based on their whims. It would require probably the entire financial system to recalibrate how it works when it's not just a fraction of the population that actively is involved in investment. Yeah. And I think it's probably something that, I mean, not in a sinister way, but that nobody's really motivated to change. It's just easier to keep things as they are with the majority of the public basically intellectually locked out from the stock market. Okay,
so that actually, I can get back now to the thing before I digressed. That's a really good segue, which is nobody's motivated to see a change. And I think that is a key to what's going on here in terms of the media and why the media has gotten so woke. So I'll explain. So first of all, there was this generational, to go back to in the New York Times and other places, this huge generational turnover where a lot of people who were not actual journalists suddenly had a lot of power because they were part of the conversation. And a lot of these people came from very elite institutions. So 50% of New York Times staff journalists went to an Ivy League university. Right now, 92% of journalists have a college degree, as opposed to just 36% of Americans. 46% of Americans have never taken a single, 36% of Americans have never taken a single college course. Okay. There's about 10% who have some college, and then, everybody else who doesn't. So you have this situation where the people tasked with telling the American story, not only are they overwhelmingly educated, higher educated than Americans, but they overwhelmingly live not just in pro-Clinton, Democratic areas, but the most democratic areas, because the local industry has collapsed. Local journalism has collapsed because of the internet. And so journalism is now much more digital. It's much more national, which means that it's much more coastal. So the journalists are more educated, live in much more expensive cities, make much more money, and live completely sequestered from other Americans. They're much less likely to be religious, and much, much more likely to be liberal. Now, it used to be that there was a countervailing force to the inherent overeducated liberalness of journalists, which was either the corporations that they worked for. Either they worked for a syndicated or a publication that belonged to, a larger corporation. So their boss was the owner of a corporation, which meant that they were more conservative, or their boss was a Republican, or they were working in a one shop town. They were working in a small town where there was only one or two newspapers. And when you have a monopoly like that, you want everybody as your readers, which means that you want an opinion page that is balanced or, totally boring, right? You don't want to offend people. You want both Republicans and Democrats to be able to read you, right? So the newspapers at that, up until, this current moment, they tended to try to court everyone. They tended to have the kind of news that a Republican or Democrat could read and not feel offended and feel like they got the story. Of course, all that changed because of the internet. So now we live in a situation where the news is incredibly nationalized, coastal. It's getting much younger because digital jobs don't pay very well and they tend to go to younger people. But those younger people, they're making $35,000 a year and living in New York City, right? That's not feasible unless you have a safety net. So it's increasingly rich, like it's really a rich man's job now. So it went over the course of 100 years from being a working class profession where, right out of high school or not even finishing high school, you could get a job and you would make a little bit more than your neighbor, the cop, to now it's this job of like total elites where you're now making a little bit less than, your neighbor, the lawyer, let's say, right? And you're living in Park Slope, and your kids are going to one of these, I don't know, fancy schools, whatever. So, there's been a total population shift in who is a journalist and where the power lies. And because of something like Twitter, where, you have people who can amass huge followings that they can now end up exerting power and influence against the editors of the New York Times. And what we're seeing now is that the editors, the sort of boomer generation, Gen X, they just don't have the cojones to stand up to being called racist by their subordinates. And with the Times, you had one more factor. And I think the reason to focus on the Times is because, is this interesting, by the way? I could stop at any moment. Okay, so I'll just say one more thing, which is that the Times plays an outsized role because, of course, with the crumbling of local journalism, the big legacy publications end up playing a much bigger role because they're sort of the last man standing. And what happened at the Times was they sort of realized that the ads were not going to online ads weren't going to bring in as much money as print ads, so they moved to a subscription model. So who are their subscribers? I mean, who's going to pay $120 a year for the New York Times? It's like people who live on the Upper West Side. Okay, the New York Times, by the way, was always for the elites, right? It started at a time. So Pulitzer, right, was doing this sort of revolution, trying to turn journalism into something for the working class. And on the other hand, you had Ox and the whole New York Times dynasty realizing they could do the opposite. That they could, if they could signal to advertisers that the working class was not buying the New York Times, they could charge more for ads because they could say, by the way, not $1 you pay us for this ad will be wasted on a poor person seeing it, Like only rich people will see it, right? Only someone who can buy a Cartier watch will be reading this anyway. So you won't be wasting your money on this $100,000 Cartier ad because no poor people will be seeing it, right? That was kind of the model they started back in, 1896, stuck with it. And now that's sort of paying off. That's the model everybody's going for now. Everyone now wants that same elite bracket. And the New York Times took it one step further. They created this program called Project Feels, which, so about, I think it was 3 years ago, they started.
Feels? Like all the feels?
Exactly. So they started asking young, affluent millennials, I believe mostly, to carefully selected, to rate how articles made them feel after they read them. And they did this for about a year, and then they created an AI program that could predict how articles would make readers feel. And they use that now to sell advertisers emotions. So they have 18 emotions that advertisers can pick. This sounds made up, okay? But it's literally on their website. They pick an emotion they want the reader to be feeling, and then they can then match them with the right article. And of course, the more the reader feels, the longer they stay on the page and the more likely they are to click on the ad. So this explains why Trump's name appears more or less every 250 words in the New York Times, because it was just a sure way to guarantee huge amounts of emotion. Right? They're literally, so it's basically the Facebook model, right? Facebook is monetizing our emotions. So the New York Times doesn't need Facebook anymore because it has this sort of 6 million subscriber base. So they're selling those emotions. So I feel like all of these things together, all of these pieces of the puzzle together, the Twitter, the desire that that reporters have to see their stories do well, right? To see their stories shared by activists on Twitter, positively, the generational shift, all of this stuff meant that there was no longer a countervailing force to the journalists' own desire to see themselves as the heroes of some, big Manichaean drama between good and evil, because the money was now in journalists following their own natural inclinations to tell stories of good versus evil. And the last piece of the puzzle is okay, so, they could have done what Pulitzer did, right? We're living in a time of massive, disgusting inequality, right? This nation is unbearably economically unequal. It's disgusting. I mean, the amount of money the top 20% makes, compared to the bottom 80%, the top 20% owns half of the income in this country. It's disgusting. I mean, it's unforgivable. Why is that happening? How is it happening? Why did the journalists not go down the economic route? Why did they choose a racial moral panic instead of saying, look, this is unjust. This is disgusting. How is it fair that my cleaning lady makes a fraction of how much I make as a journalist, and she's working so much harder than me? Why? It's exactly why, because exactly what you said, Adam. They don't want anything to change on the economic front because they're part of the elites. And I think that at some unconscious level, they understand that. They understand that, they want to be the heroes of a social justice story. They want to be Woodward and Bernstein, okay? But if they pick the real evil in this country, which is disgusting economic inequality, that's going to change their lives. And why do that when there was an alternative right there, which is a moral panic about racial inequality that demanded that they change nothing about their lives because race is an immutable characteristic that you cannot do anything about. You cannot do anything about your white privilege except feel guilty. Whereas your economic privilege, you could literally end it in a day, But who wants to do that? Who really wants to give up on that? So that's sort of, in short, how I see the crisis that we're in and why journalism has played a huge role in mainstreaming a moral panic around wokeness, cancel culture, open borders, anti-Zionism. All of these things sort of fit together as a distraction from the real and disastrous inequality in this nation.
Wow, there is a lot there.
There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot.
Sorry.
But just no, that's great. We're gonna hopefully spend the rest of the time unpacking it all. But just to in other words, I think you're saying that the hyper focus on race relations is essentially a misdirection from the media in order to not grapple with economic inequality.
Yeah, and
is kind of
exactly
what it's coming down to.
And I think everything that you guys mentioned, that feeling of the deplatforming, abdication of that raucous debate, that used to be the point of journalism. Instead, now they're making it smaller and smaller, like what is the legitimate opinions, like a power grab, essentially. I mean, some of it stems from just like the terror of being called a racist. It is horrible. It's horrible. And like I like to say, like, it's a tacit admission that they know you're not a racist, because a real racist would not mind being called a racist. Like, they do it to hurt you, so they know it will hurt you. They know that you're not. You know what I mean? And it's like at some point we have to be able to say, like, that's not what that word means. Like that's not what that word means.
I mean, yeah, I wrote a whole article about this in July about the word racist and what it's come to mean and the expansiveness of its definition. Because I mean, so the the blog post that I wrote was kind of talking about how difficult it is when you're trying to do two things with the word racist. Like, at once you're attempting to take away the pejorative sting of it and explain that, like, listen, the status quo is one that basically dehumanizes Black people. The status quo is one that, takes away their power, and therefore that's the way that we're using the word racist. And so, we need to come to terms with this new definition of racism, one that you shouldn't necessarily feel like bad about it. It should just be a moment of reflection for us to talk about how everything we do in a racist society is racist, right? But at the
in a society structured on some racist institutions. This is the just to be clear, this is the Ibram Kendi formulation.
Yeah.
By his definition, a racist society isn't one where people are necessarily bigoted personally, but one which has historically benefited a certain caste or class of people, and we are still reaping the benefits of that or suffering the consequences of that.
Yeah.
That is the version of, like, trying to take out the sting that you're describing.
Yeah, and to the credit, because I was not somebody particularly versed in this world before, maybe the summer when all of this started to pop up on my feed, and to the credit, it did work. It worked, actually. Like, that new definition of racism did put like a bit of a light bulb in my head, and it allowed me to kind of recognize a lot of the ways in which our society has been and is racist in a way that it just hadn't clicked before. I knew it on some level, but it kind of clicked on a deeper level. So to its credit, it was successful in that. What I write about in the piece is that, on the other hand, nobody's giving up the pejorative sting. Like, everyone's using it more expansively, but still wielding it as a weapon. And so when you do that, you get these like contradictory forces where you're in theory trying to push some sort of dialogue and conversation around how to move forward and past these racist structures, and at the same time you're scaring the shit out of people, right, and kind of preventing them from even engaging in that dialogue. By
pejorative accusation, you mean
like just
systemic as opposed to personal, right? The individual accusation of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So why is that, Vanessa? I love the way you put that. I totally agree. So you have to ask yourself, why? Why are they doing that? Well, who benefits from that? Who gains power from that? Like when Kendi says, when he writes in his book, we're all racist. I too am racist, right? But then insists on using it as a cudgel against people who disagree with his policy proposals, right? It's such a genius power move, right? It's like, it's a genius power move. I don't think he's doing it on purpose. But we have to reject that, because you're exactly right. It's a complete contradiction. It can't both be that it is, in the air that we breathe and that it is still an insult. And I personally think it is incredibly important that it still be an insult, because it is the worst thing you can be. And like, it is an insult to the actual victims of genocide, and the actual victims of apartheid, and the actual victims of segregation and slavery, and all the things we did in this country that were terrible and continue to do in this country that are terrible. It's like really important that we be able to call Derek Chauvin a racist, and that it still means something, and that it not be that he is the same thing as other people. Like, to me, that's where the moral panic comes in. Moral panics, they rely on two things. First thing they rely on is a consensus, right? like if you don't have a consensus that witches are bad or that pedophiles are bad, you just have a culture war, right? You don't get a moral panic until there's consensus in the society. And for the first time in American history, there is huge consensus that racism is bad and evil, you know? And the second thing you need for a moral panic is it's lurking, you know, the big evil is lurking in the least expected places. You know, it's like the little old lady who's a kindergarten teacher is actually molesting your children, you know, like, oh, the single woman at the edge of town who has no social power is actually a witch. You know what I mean? It's always like lurking in and that's, you know, I think Robin DiAngelo's new book is called like Nice White Racists or something like that. You know, like it's exactly in the place you would least expect to find it, you know, like, oh, maybe it's under this rock. Maybe it's under this rock. It's like, no, we know exactly where it is. You know, it's like in mass incarceration, you know, like we know where it is. It's not like a mystery, you know, it's that whole thing to me, this moral panic. It's like, so I ask myself, who's gaining power? And it is incredibly powerful. So 51% of African Americans oppose affirmative action. They think it's insulting, okay? 51%. But if you go into liberal spaces and you say, I think, you know, affirmative action is insulting, you will get called a racist. It's like, I'm happy to be the kind of racist who 51% of Black people are also. Like, I happen to support affirmative action, by the way, but I'm just saying as an example, like what is, you know, the point of denuding that word of its power in some contexts, but keeping it in others is so that people pushing specific policies can then tar the people who don't support their policies as racist. So if you follow Jamal Bowman on Twitter, he is constantly calling things white supremacy. You know, the filibuster is white supremacy. Standardized testing is white supremacy. Like, these things are not white supremacy. But so why does he call them that? It's like to give power. It gives him power to call people who oppose his policy, you know, the worst thing you can be. But it's such a horrible thing to do. Like, you know, it's just so.
I just want to emphasize, though, because I think just for listeners who may not be as familiar with your writing, I do want to emphasize that when you write about this stuff, you make it incredibly clear that you're very glad that we're having this reckoning at the moment, because we were past due for acknowledgement of the inequities happening to Black and brown people in this country. So I just want to make clear that as much as there is moral panic about it, it's not like you are not acknowledging that it was very necessary.
Let me make that clear as well. There are lingering pockets of institutional racism in America, and there is no more urgent calling than to fix those. What's very exciting about this moment is that we have partners on the right who are anxious to be doing this as well. So it will probably surprise many of your listeners to know that the states that are at the forefront of criminal justice reform are red states. And they're doing it for a combination of fiscal and Christian reasons. But they have overseen more prisoner releases, as did President Trump, than any on the left. Any.
And by the way, this has been the case for almost a decade,
exactly.
Way before police shooting burst up into the lexicon of the New York Times as a big story. Think tanks on the right have been obsessing about justice reform. It has some Christian underpinnings, it has some fiscal considerations, but it's also the libertarian streak that exists on the American right, just parts of it, that justly views over-incarceration as the most abominable infringement of individual freedom.
Absolutely, yeah. So I would say, so on mass incarceration, I totally agree with you. For a decade, the right has been really at the forefront of this. While Chuck Schumer was blocking it in New York State, okay?
Right.
On police brutality, I do think that this summer was incredibly important. I never thought I would live to hear Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell talk about America's original sin and talk about the need to, you know, really reevaluate policing. It was an incredible moment. And so when I talk about moral...
And words from Lindsey Graham carry so much water.
Exactly, right? So what are people will say to me, well, what are those words worth? I mean, they're the first step is the words, right? Like, you know, if that's the first step, it's not worth nothing. You know, there is a difference between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, you know, and it's that one of them is paying lip service to nonviolence and the other is not, and that matters. more than paying.
That's what I always tell Vanessa. Hypocrisy is valuable. At least there's some ideal that you're holding yourself against and failing to live up to.
So I think to me, Vanessa, and I really appreciate you bringing that up, like there is a huge difference between the actual racism in America that we actually need to fix right now, and then the moral panic around, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think, the word equity is often the tell, like, do you want equality or do you want equity? To me, the word equity is about what Hannah Arendt called, not the pursuit of equality, but a reversal of the personnel of, oppressor and oppressed. We don't want the reversal of personnel. We want an equal society. And I think that the majority of people of color want that too, according to polling. And so to me, that's really another tell is like when you see liberal and lefty writers calling people of color, often working class people of color who are not as extreme as them on race issues, the handmaidens of white supremacy. No, it doesn't work that way, And I think if you peel back the curtain, so much of this is about class. So much of it is about class. And Adam, I'm really interested in what you think about this because I'm really interested in people who grew up in other societies. So my father's British, but I spent many years in Israel as a teenager. And, having experienced very different class societies coming back to America, like we have a very, very strict class delineation, but it's very unacknowledged. It's very taboo to talk about it. And you saw this, for example, with Trump, where people started saying, if you mentioned the economic anxiety of his supporters, that was a dog whistle. And I thought to myself, my God, how rich and economically secure do you have to be to call it racist for somebody to talk about their economic anxiety? Like, it's just it was so perfect, it was just horrifying, but also like a perfect encapsulation of this.
It's part of the American myth that this is the classless society, right? This is something that has been moving on the right, and I'm actually a little bit queasy about it. See, the right is trying to steal the base of class warfare now. There was a blog by, what's his name, Scott Anderson, I think. He was entreating the right to take over the class issue from the left. And just today, as if answering the call, I saw a Ben Shapiro headline from a podcast episode or something that said, the left is the new aristocracy. And yeah, sure, there's something about that. I'm just very uncomfortable with the right making this argument. Not because I'm dismissing the fact that that the American right had a much more complicated relationship with class than usually the left gives them credit. It's just that I feel dishonest opportunism in the way that a lot of the new class warriors of the right, people who would regularly go on Fox News under Obama to decry class warfare, and I'm sure would do the same as loudly during the Biden administration, aren't the champions I would trust with combating the American aristocracy. It's like we keep saying, it's a game that's being played between two extent aristocracies, and each of them is trying to assert itself at the expense of the other without actually changing the rules of the game, without anybody really wanting to countenance a real change to the status quo.
So I really appreciate what you just said. As somebody who really only cares about, improving the lot of the working class, I feel like, by the way, the working class of all races, people often think the working class is white. It's not. It's incredibly diverse. I feel like it's so great that the Republicans are giving the Democrats a run for their money. Good. You know what? Go for it. I thought, Mitt Romney's, he had a great proposal for minimum wage. Josh Hawley had a great proposal for, I love to see that. You know what I mean? Make them freaking fight for it, because what happened actually was, we say working class, it means two things. There's an economic component and there's a cultural component, right? There's being economically working class, which means like, you're a wage laborer, right? You make minimum wage, right? But then there's also sort of a more complex version of it, which is that, you kind of are in opposition to the college educated elite. It's really the college is very much a dividing line, and there's a culture associated with that. For a long time in this country, we look down on, quote unquote, white trash, right? And then there came a moment like 20 years ago where, they were like, we're going to reclaim this, and those people, some of them make good money, some of them make better money than, journalists, right? If you're a contractor, let's say, if you have a small business that takes off, it's not all about money. And what you really see is like, outlets like Fox News, for example, Rush Limbaugh, these outlets have really perfected bringing those two populations together, the sort of wage laborer, economic working class, with the more cultural working class, by never talking about economics, by really focusing on the cultural war issues and focusing on this, that allowed them to sort of, cater to the more affluent set with sort of free market stuff. But that would never have worked. They would never have, and this is where Thomas Frank, what's the matter with Kansas, really got it wrong. That would never have worked if the Democrats hadn't completely abandoned the working class economically. If there was anything for them to have a dignified, autonomous, independent life from the Democrats, they would never have abandoned them. What ended up happening was the Democrats gave them nothing economically and insulted their culture. And the Republicans, they didn't give them anything economically, but at least they didn't insult them. They didn't insult their religion. They didn't insult the few things they could grasp onto that still gave them a sense of pride, despite the fact that they had lost every battle, cultural battle, economic battle in America. So to me, like, how can you talk smack about Fox News when it's giving, the people who are lowest on the totem pole a sense of pride, and all we do is make them feel like garbage? Like it's just, people, the New York Times loves writing these articles, Fox News ate my parents. Fox News turned my parents into zombies. It doesn't work that way. Fox News is not conservative. Working class people are not conservative because they watch Fox News. Fox News is conservative because it's catering to the working class. And the working class tends to be conservative because they cannot afford ridiculous ideas that like people who are well educated and have a lot of money can afford. When a person who's working class has a child out of wedlock, right? Just something that like, people do all the time who are, first of all, in Scandinavia, upper class people do this all the time, but also like, the sexual revolution, let's say, when working class people have a child out of wedlock, that child is on a downward mobility trajectory. Like just in terms of data, like their ability to rise socially is halved. Okay. When a poor person gets caught with drugs, right, they're going away for a much longer time than somebody, smoking weed in their like Park Slope apartment, which is, has been legalized, de facto basically forever. Right. So you have these like, liberal ideas that get associated with the left, and the working class always ends up paying the price for them. Open borders, this idea that like flatters the vanity, of affluent liberals. Like, let's take care of the poor of every other nation. Who's paying the cost for your vanity? It's the working class. You cannot have a wage floor when you have an unlimited supply of undocumented labor. It's impossible, right? And that used to be a lefty idea. As recently as 2015, Bernie Sanders was out there being like, right, open borders, that's a Koch brothers proposal. You know what I mean? And it's like by 2020, he was up there saying, no, we have to decriminalize illegal border crossing. I forget what question was. I'm so sorry. Every time I stop talking, I'm like, all right, Batya, shut up. You're done. Just let them talk. You're not saying anything else.
I apologize. I apologize that I was when you mentioned Rush Limbaugh before, and I was giggling like an idiot 9-year-old. I really worked hard, and I should get credit for it, to suppress immediately saying "rest in power." But sorry, I had to put it into the record. But I was like, I did not cut your flow, and I'm very proud of myself. The question that comes to me, that, well, there are 17 different ones. You keep saying that the left abandoned the working class, and I think that's a point that might not be obvious to some listeners, to what extent that is true, because people will say, sure, even if we agree that the left has its vanity projects and, things like Robin DiAngelo that are very clearly an Opus Dei type self-flagellation for white guilt repentance and nothing more, and without any real social agenda to it. But you could still say that the welfare state, while not necessarily as competent as we'd like, is still better than the corporate welfare that the Mitch McConnells of the world promulgate. But in the spirit of self-indulgence and contrarianism, I will admit that there is a big case that the right can make that they are the class warriors now. And I expect, Batya, that you're going to make the case from economics. I want to make one point about policing first. You remember the Li Fang story?
Oh, yeah, he's great. Totally.
So he's an Asian American reporter for The Intercept. And during the height of the George Floyd protests, he was traveling across the country doing his reporting. And in one of the demonstrations, he offered attendees to come up and just share a statement or whatever their thoughts are. And he would just publish them verbatim to Twitter. And then one of the protesters who approached him, a black man, said, "Yeah, I have something to say." And he said, "Yes, this protest is wonderful, and I'm so glad that we're finally having these conversations. But I also have a problem that Black lives only matter when it serves some media narrative, or specifically, in this case, when white police take them." And his point was that he had a brother and other family members and friends who were murdered during the crime surge due to lack of policing. And he said, why doesn't the media ever talk about this? And it was really heartfelt and expressed this terrible, tragic story with so much nuance. And Li Fang just posted it straight up to Twitter as a video, and he got lambasted for it by his fellow reporters on The Intercept. And he was condemned as racist because he allowed a black person to proclaim a view that was in contradiction with the prevalent opinion of abolish the police. And, when you go back to the history of the late 20th century in the US, systemic racism took the form of under-policing. People were complaining about all the good policing resources going to white neighborhoods because black lives weren't valued as much. And so it's not like law and order is an inherently Fox Newsy idea. But once it got tainted as such by the academies of the New York Times and the liberal elite, then if you even suggest that crime hurts minority neighborhoods and that we need better policing, not an abolished police, then you get flagged as racist. And so to me, this is an example of class warfare. This is an intellectualizing elite that completely ignores the actual needs of working class families in the neighborhoods that are most immediately impacted by policing, good or bad. And attempts by people like Li Fang to even give voice to those people living in those neighborhoods gets flagged as racist because it doesn't fit the aristocratic narrative.
I could not agree with you more. If you look at the data, 81% of Black Americans said they want the police to spend the same amount of time in their neighborhoods or more. And so what did the Democrats run on? Defund the police. It's a perfect example of, Democrats increasingly being aligned with, the college educated, and the Republicans being able to sweep up working class people of all races. Now, I really appreciate your question. Like, obviously, very few Republicans care about the working class, right? Not one of them voted for the child tax credit or for the COVID bill, basically, that had, this supposedly conservative, pro-child provision in it. I want to make 2 points. The first is that, a strong welfare state, which you're right, right now, the Democrats represent much more than the Republicans, is not a pro-working class platform, right? The working class very much often sees itself as in tension with welfare recipients because they end up paying the taxes, and they often see themselves as paying taxes to people who are not working. Now, of course, they may be right or wrong about that. In many cases, they're wrong, right? We have this corporate welfare situation where people can work very long hours and still have no benefits and rely on the welfare state. But that's obviously terrible. And I've spoken to a lot of working class people, Republicans of all races, who are wrong about that. They see welfare recipients as, people who are unfairly benefiting from their labor. At the same time, kind of like what we started with, there is a way in which a lot of the Democrats' policies do seem writ large to be about creating a permanent underclass Universal basic income is a really good example. That's not a pro-working class position, because the working class wants the dignity of labor, right? So what you have is people in Silicon Valley who are trying to make labor obsolete through this new version of automation, right? And they're saying, well, it's okay. We'll just pay everybody $20,000 a year to not work. That's not a pro-working class platform, right?
Can I push on that a
little?
Yeah,
Sure.
Yeah, because I mean, from what I've read about UBI, and you're absolutely right that it derives from like a Silicon Valley intellectual, or at least getting pushed and funded by Silicon Valley elites. Like totally right. But from what I've seen of, for example, the trial that was in Stockton, California, with the Mayor Tubbs who kind of implemented it there. None of the people who received the UBI, and to be fair, this is not actually UBI because it wasn't universal, because it was for a segment of the population that earned under the median income for their zip code. But that aside, every single person who received this monthly stipend, if they were working, they were able to maintain their employment, and if they were unemployed, a lot of them were actually able to gain employment, and so the supplemental income was just enough to allow them to pay off things like groceries or hospital bills, so that they could and then have the time, or maybe even stop a part-time job so that they could start looking for a full-time job. So it didn't seem antithetical at all to having a job. It seemed actually potentially like a job spur, having that monthly income.
And add to that the problem of indignity that UBI solves for, because in a normal safety net, you need to stand in line for unemployment and you need to go through a humiliating bureaucratic process. Here you don't. So you're spared the cognitive tax of indignity.
So you're saying using it as unemployment.
An unemployment benefit that is destigmatized from what it means to be unemployed.
So as you guys have just demonstrated, this idea very much appeals to people in our socioeconomic situation, right? Like but it does, when you talk to working class people, it is insulting. And to me, the question I would pose to you, Vanessa, is why are there jobs in America that are full-time jobs or even part-time jobs that a person cannot live on?
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with that.
I know you totally agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why are we creating Band-Aids on a bullet wound, And who used to know this? Elizabeth Warren. She wrote this amazing book, The Two-Income Trap, which was an anti-feminist book. I'm sorry, but it was in a glorious way. It was like, what she was saying was we've created a society where both parents have to work. Instead of being a society where someone is home with the children. Like how did we allow that to happen? We allowed it to happen because, and I totally believe this, the media abandoned the working class. And when it did that, everyone realized there's this concept in the Talmud, hefker. It's I don't know if it's in Hebrew, actually. Modern Hebrew probably doesn't have it.
Hefker.
It means like abandoned. It means something that basically comes up in law. So let's say you find a wallet in the street. Do you have to return it or can you keep it? There are actually hundreds of pages devoted to this very difficult and important question in the Talmud. And one of the ways of determining it is it hefker? Does it look abandoned? Is it clear that no one is looking for this anymore? It's in such a bad state. It's nobody's responsibility anymore. Then you can claim
it's a broken window.
Exactly. And I think that the media conveyed that the working class was hefker, that you could destroy their jobs, destroy their incomes, get rid of their jobs, have the money, have no wage growth, and we will not speak out about it. You can get away with that.
But isn't automation real to the extent that it has a deleterious effect?
It's a choice, Adam. It's a choice. It's always a choice to pursue that. Globalization, outsourcing of manufacturing, pursuing trade deals with China. Like, who thought that was a good idea? Democrats thought that was a good idea. I do want to make one more point to your really good, but both of you. Oh no, kitten on the roadcaster. Getting used to having both a cat and a roadcaster. I did want to make one more point. So yes, the Democrats right now are moving in a more populist, I wouldn't even want to call it populist, but a more pro working class, lower class direction after Trump. And this is very hard to admit. before Trump, Clinton, Obama, these guys were like at the forefront of trade deals that were disastrous for the working class. Trump was a populist. He didn't deliver on a lot of his promises. You know, he was really full of it, you know, like, but he conveyed to the working class that he was on their side, which is not worth nothing, that is worth something. And his economy was working for the bottom court, 25%. They saw a 4.5% wage increase. The top 25% only saw a 2.5% wage increase under Trump in 2019. He renegotiated NAFTA. It's now the most pro-labor trade deal the United States has ever signed. You know, he made a lot of promises he didn't keep. He was full of it, but he did have his eye on that. I mean, it came from Steve Bannon, who was, you know, kicked out and overruled by, you know, the tax cuts and Mitch McConnell and whatever. And what does Trump actually, who does he even care about? Nobody except himself. But he managed to do something, which was he platformed these people and their needs and their wishes their need to be seen. And he made their problems significant and real again. And I don't know that the Democrats would be here if not for Trump. I know that, you know, the squad wouldn't exist if not for Trump, right? And to the extent to, I don't think that the squad are pro-working class at all, but to the extent to which the progressive wing is influencing these policies, that is very much, I think, because of Trump. And it is really interesting when you look at, like, you know, for example, free college, right? Just one more example that, you know, is always being, you know, pushed as this kind of like socialist agenda.
Oh, don't get me started on that.
It's like you're not trying to make a strong working class when you tell everyone to go to college. You're trying to make no working class, right? Like, it's an attempt to actually. And why do they want there to be no working class? Because the working class is increasingly voting for Republicans, right? And this has been a facet of.
I mean, that I'll push back on that, because I do think that's a little bit of a straw man of the liberal position, much as I take pleasure in throwing punches at the left. I do think that there is a naive but honest belief on the left that the ideal society that we're trying to engineer is this Aristotelian utopia where everybody can fulfill their otium. Everyone wears a toga and can be whatever they want to be. A poem, a flute player,
a podcaster.
And a podcaster. Like, nobody wants to be working 10 hours a day in a factory
but that's
if they
the
can.
Thing. That is.
No, I know, but I think that that's an honest belief. My point is not that I agree with it. I just say that I really think that I don't think that they're trying to eliminate that culture because it's Republican. I think they're trying to eliminate it because they think that this is having a working class is in itself the oppressive product of late stage capitalism, and eliminating it is our path forward to a more enlightened society.
I would agree with you before they voted for Trump, before they had the audacity to spit in the faces of their betters and impose their wish on us. Now I think it really is about.
Fuck them.
It's about, you said it.
It's kind of getting back to this like false consciousness thing that you bring up in your piece today about the kind of condescension of so seemingly knowing what they want, and if they don't want it, then it's because they don't know better, like that. Today being March 10th, by the way, because this will definitely not be airing today. Yes, it's a great piece. You should go check it out. But it does bringing up this piece, and I know we have not that much time left, so I do want to bring up this idea of this misdirection towards race and away from economics. For me, it just feels like a little bit of a leap. Even if the media isn't talking about class as much as it should, it doesn't mean that, you know, we and the media shouldn't be talking about race right now, right?
Well, I'm not sure we need to be talking about race in the way that we are. I find it very dehumanizing. All of my Black friends do, and certainly, you know, a lot of people of color. Well, invoking your Black friends is white supremacy, so. I know, I shouldn't have said that. I'm not supposed to admit that I have them because it's so, you know, like, it's like a dog whistle, right? I know, I think that people are, you know, find it extremely dehumanizing. Like we've reached a stage where we are now looking past people's humanity to their race. And the thing that the moral panic around race does is like, at some point, let me put it this way, because I want to be precise about this. Who is this benefiting? Like who is defund the police benefiting when 81% of African Americans oppose that view? Like, how did that become the position of the left? Like, how did a view that is so wrong for, the communities who most need our attention, how did that become the lingua franca? That's the question I'm trying to answer. How did this academic fringe view, this woke view that doesn't say we have certain areas in our country that we need to fix, but says rather everything is about race, like that is the first thing you reach for in every conversation. How did that happen? How did there become a market among, the people who read the New York Times, right? So among liberal white elites, right? Affluent liberal whites, how did they want to become the consumers of a moral panic? And it's about them, right? So back to Adam's point, so the New York Times in 2020 ran over 700 articles about white supremacy. They ran one article about the historic rising crime in inner cities. Okay. Like this stuff is not for the victims of those crimes, hundreds of children who have been murdered, who no one cares about. No one will say their names, It's for the Cartier watch ad consumer, right? So why do they want to be told that they are, hopelessly racist, hopelessly benefiting from and enabling a white supremacy? That was the question I was trying to answer, is how did there become a market for such an extreme view that 10 years ago would have been seen for the fringe academic malarkey that it is? That's what I was trying to answer. And so because I guess I am a bit of at the end of the day, a vulgar Marxist, I was asking, okay, who's benefiting from this? How are they benefiting from it? And to me, it seems clear that it's just the perfect distraction. Because on the one hand, liberals have become, the Democrats have become increasingly identified with the college educated, with the elites who are benefiting from the current economic system, right? On the other hand, they're still liberals. They still think they are the compassionate people. They are the ones who are, who care about the disenfranchised and the poor. And so they, this kind of woke overcorrection on race is what it is. We still have areas we need to correct, but we have jumped right over all those areas we need to correct, where we have partners on the right, jumped right over them to DEI committees and telling children that they are little white supremacists when they're 3 years old, right? So that was the perfect, it was the perfect defense of the status quo is what I'm trying to say, because the real inequality is not economic, according to, this view. It's racial. And if it's racial, you can't fix it. Right? Because race is immutable. That's kind of how I came to see it.
And never underestimate the cheap intellectual narcissism of it, and also the very low cost attempts at repentance, which goes back. Vanessa and I had a conversation with our journalist friend Yashika Dutt, who wrote a great book about the Indian caste system and how it interplays with the West. And one of the most fascinating things for me is just how self-centered the Western elites are, even in their self-criticism, because the only way in which an American academy and the American literati can talk about the Orient or India or the rest of the world is through the prism of the white oppressor. They completely ignore, they're incapable of seeing the difference in history and culture and the unique form of class, racial, and ethnic inequality in those places, because there can only be one prime mover, and that is white supremacy or European colonialism. It's this totally self-obsessed theology.
Well, I push back on theology as a religious person. I don't like when people call wokeness religion, because religion is all about forgiveness and grace and recognizing.
Some religions are. Some religions are.
Well, Well, our religion is, and Christianity, I don't know as well as ours, but I know that grace is really important. And
no, I mean, those are two.
Yeah. Well, okay, fair enough. My Muslim friends tell me that Islam also has a big component of forgiveness. And
I'll give you 3.
but those are the American religions, right? Like,
is your Marxist religion in favor of forgiveness?
No, but I mean, it is very popular to call wokeness a religion, and I just feel like it's the opposite of religion, because like the whole point of religion is to hold yourself up to an ideal and find yourself wanting, and to always hold yourself to a higher standard than you hold others, and always seek to forgive others and give the benefit of the doubt, and know that we are all created in God's image and all, equally, I don't want to say sinners because it's not really a Jewish concept, but like, equally flawed and always trying to do better. So to me, it doesn't, like, when I see people saying, oh, wokeness is religion, I'm like, you're not religious and you don't know any religious people and you've never spent any time in like church or synagogue, because that's not how religions work at all.
Thank you for opening this door. Spent many a day in synagogues in one of the most, I'd say, theocratic cities in the Western world, if you consider Israel part of the West, or a very theocratic city. And I have a slightly different view of religion than you. But let me just say that I think the comparison to wokeness is, and generally to forms of ideology, can be very compelling when you take into account that, yeah, sure, religion has that component of redemption, atonement, and absolution of self. But then you have the more like radical fundamentalist version, which, let's not talk about what we can see now in Mea Shearim in Jerusalem or in Wahhabi Islamism. Let's just think about, let's go historical. Let's talk about the Tzdukim and Prushim in old Judea, or let's talk about all the Puritan sects of 16th, 17th century Britain. Those are feverish, enthusiastic fanatics who have developed their own self-referential Gnostic code, which sees everyone as overflowing with sin. The world is corrupt, humanity is fallen, and the only way to overcome it is committing to either a monastic lifestyle or adopting a regula of weird, esoteric behaviors and practices that communicate your loyalty to some cosmic order and your renunciation of this fetid world in the name of a higher, godlier justice. And it's through these eccentric customs and acts that you mark yourself as one of the righteous few. And it happened often throughout history that the moneyed elites, whether they were landed nobility or whatever, wanted to associate themselves with those fanatics because they felt, gosh, those weirdos are really going all out. I guess they must be onto something. Otherwise, why else would they be so crazy? Maybe we should just give them all our money and throw our lots with them so that we increase our chances to cross the pearly gates. So corporations doing virtue signaling and siding with the woke is nothing new.
I'm feeling the uncomfortable feeling of suspecting perhaps I have been wrong all this time about something, because that is a very compelling challenge. And my response that I want to make, I think, is weak, but I'm going to make it anyway. And I'm going to go back to the drawing board on this question. My response is that the examples you brought up are actually examples of politics, not of religion. And that the fighting between those sects was political fighting over institutional power rather than over a spiritual practice, which definitely Tzdukim and Prushim, there was no concept of the inner self at that point yet in Judaism. And so it wouldn't have had a spiritual component in the way that we would recognize for a religion today. But I hear myself saying that, and I feel that what you said was stronger, and that this is sort of just the last gasp of me not wanting to let go of something that I've long believed. So
probably because you respect religion and you see the goodness that it has brought you in your life, and because you are highly critical of wokeness, there's probably like a dissonance there. Like, no, those things aren't similar at all.
This is actually Christopher Lash's point that about religion, but I think that you're right that at least by the Middle Ages, people were using mystical, spiritual language to talk about political fights. And so the distinction I'm trying to draw to save my losing side and my investment in this argument is not really valid. Like, it seems like almost a distinction without a meaning. So I'm going to really think about what you said.
And I think I suspect, and maybe I'm projecting here, but some of the view of religion that you have is, I guess, what, like we mentioned in our interview with Tomer Persico and Tom Holland, and what of some of their type of scholarship asserts is that this is a much later Christianized, essentially, Protestant version of the self as being the center of the religious experience. The internal dialogue of the individual with the infinite on one hand and the corporeal on the other as being the central drama of religion. Whereas for the majority of history, religion really was, if you can even call it religion, is just a natural connection to your tribe, to your politics, to your state. It was just another feature, another layer of your social existence.
It's interesting you say that, because I grew up extremely religious. I was then secular for many, many years and then came back to it after I read Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone.
Right.
It's just kind of funny. I know. I read that book, and as a patriot, I felt like, no, I have to reinvest in the social fabric. And then that brought on a spiritual reawakening. And I sort of returned to the religion of my youth that I had like long abandoned on feminist grounds and whatever. So I did come back to it from a point of view, like from a communal point of view, from the idea that like a healthy society needs this. And I look at what liberal America looks like, it feels godless in a way that bothers me. Like the sanctity of human life is absent. But I think you're right. It's absent on the right as well, where you have more like, does Jerry Falwell have like a deep sense of the sanctity of human life? No. But when I go into, when I go to the South and I go to church, like it is extremely powerful. And in America, at least, where we are so committed to our freedoms, it does seem like without religion, we're going down a dark path of sort of abandoning each other and the social fabric. And so that's sort of what drew me back. But I have to think a lot about what you said, Adam. It's a really good point.
I'm certainly big on communitarianism, for what it's worth.
Yeah, but does it work without God? I mean, that's the thing, is you sort of...
That's a question that keeps coming back. Does it work without God? I think it should. I think it better.
You think that because you're Israeli, because Israel is a very communitarian society. And the reason it is so communitarian is because the enemy is so obvious. And I think that really, my partner, he spent many years, spent 3 years as a child on a moshav, which is a little village in Gaza, basically, before Israel withdrew from Gaza. They had like little farm villages there, basically, of settlers. And he said he's never in his entire life ever met people that nice. And they were so nice to each other and so nice to this Russian kid who like barely spoke Hebrew. They like treated him like a king. Everywhere else in Israel, they hate Russians. They're so mean to them. They treated him so well. And they were so racist, like to the Arabs. And it was just that went together. Like when you have such a clear enemy, you become really tightly knit. And the whole of it, I don't think the whole of Israel is racist against Arabs, but the society itself, I think because it has such a clear sense of where the threat is coming from, is very, very tightly knit. And if you could get that without the racism, it would be like so great.
And I think it's a great observation. And I think you even see that right now if you're looking discerningly enough in what's happening in Israeli society in the past 10 years, where security issues have been, at least seemingly, creating the impression that they're resolved, providing the Israeli side, obviously not the Palestinians, with years of quiet and illusory serenity. And what happened during this peace? Israel becomes radically more neoliberal.
Totally. So true.
And it's more lonely. Do you have a time for one more question?
Of course.
Great, because you took us down the perfect segue for the Jewish question.
Uh-huh.
So what's your final solution? Sorry.
I'm happy to talk about that.
Okay.
Oh, did you mean that seriously? Like for Israel? Like
no.
Oh, okay, you were joking.
No,
Okay.
for the Jewish problem. What's the thing with Jews and social justice?
With Jews. What's up with you guys?
It's something that's fascinated me in my own kind of identitarian narcissism. The difference between the way that Israeli Jews understand what it means to be part of the community, part of the group, part of
oh my God,
Jewishness.
can I just say, Israelis are the worst. Like, they make it so much harder. They'll say things that are so anti-Semitic. They'll be like, oh yeah, APAC, our friends at APAC, I'm winking. And it's like, don't talk that way like that, but they don't get it. Like, they don't get it because like they are the majority.
I mean, but come on, APAC, come on. Fucking Benjamins, come on.
It's really problematic. Sorry, go on.
No, but this is exactly it. Like, stay on it, because I find this divide, the diaspora Jews versus the community in Israel, fascinating. And I think there is a huge and widening gulf between how those two communities understand themselves, what being Jewish, what belonging to the community means for each of them is becoming less and less compatible with time. Like, you have the internationalist Tikkun Olam American Jews, and then you have the nationalistic Israeli community, and between them there's this schism. And then you have the question of anti-Zionism and whether that's anti-Semitism, which also plays on the relationship between those two communities. So basically, it's a bucket of a million questions, and because I promised this is going to be the last one, pick your favorite version of the question and run with it.
Okay. Israeli Jews are a majority with a minority living amongst them. And then, of course, an occupation. So, American Jews are a minority living in a majority country. So we're going to have fundamentally different views of the point of a liberal democracy, right? Like, is the point of a liberal democracy to, define a majority culture and, give it a home and do its best to protect its minorities? Or is the point of a liberal democracy the celebration of difference, right? It's just two different ways of relating to, again, it's like your narcissism, but it's also just your status. And I think it's especially fraught in Israel because of the Holocaust. Like, it was just, imagine having that whole conversation, then having the Holocaust, like, animating all of the, every conversation behind it. So from that point of view, we just have I think that the role that diaspora Jews can play for Israel. So
you're saying the Holocaust was a negative on balance?
I mean, I think this is fair to call it that. So I think for me, the role that diaspora Jews play, not just to Israeli Jews, but to the world, is we remind you that liberal democracy can work. We are the promise of a liberal democracy fulfilled. We are a minority that lives not just tolerated, but celebrated, protected. I always think of that moment with the Pittsburgh shooting when, oh God, I always get emotional when I think about this. I'm sorry. But the cops ran in and threw themselves, like, in the line of fire, like, for a Jew, like, with our history, to see that, like, it used to be the cops were perpetrating the pogroms in the old country, and here they literally died, like, saving us, protecting us, and we're unique. Like, Black people don't get that, that's just, we know that. That's, but we say to the world, look, it's possible, like, not to hate your minorities. It's possible to truly love them and celebrate them. It's possible to have them so integrated into the fabric of your society that, you cannot imagine your world without them, and we have a responsibility to ensure that happens for all minorities in America, from Muslims and African Americans and Latinos and everybody, Asian Americans right now who are under threat, who are not being insured, protected in that same way. And that's the reminder we serve to Israelis as well, like, you should treat your minorities a little bit better. Like, look, this is, we're Jews.
Like, dial down the apartheid, guys.
At the same time, I think it must be infuriating for Israelis to have to endure, American Jews who are not stakeholders, who can't vote in Israel, who are sitting here, from the safety of our Brooklyn apartments and, like, lecturing you about. And I think the thing that drives me nuts personally is when they talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in racial terms. It's not a racial conflict; it's a national conflict. And the Palestinians are, yes, there is an occupation, but they are also agents. They have a lot of agency, and they have over the years had a lot of agency that they have misused. So, that we use our paradigm and misapply it to Israel. Israelis use their paradigm, wink, wink, nudge, nudge about AIPAC, misapply it to us, it's a problem. But it's not a big problem. Like you said, the Stukim and the Prushim, they literally killed each other. 250 years ago, Jews were giving each other up to
the Tsar.
And right now, between Israel, American Jews and Israeli Jews in the diaspora, it seems to me very, very minor and mild. And a lot of it was caused by Trump. Trump was so close with Bibi Netanyahu, he made him, and American Jews hated Trump so much that suddenly they were, now that he's gone, it's like, bye, and they'll go back to being like Israel's total cheerleaders. Go do occupation. We don't care. So I think it's totally gonna die down. About anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, it's a really important question. Two Jews, three opinions. Jews do not agree on this topic. I respect a lot of people who think that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. I respect a lot of people who think it's not. I personally don't think it's inherently anti-Semitic. I respect certainly any Palestinian who says, I wish there was no Jewish state. I understand why, you have paid the price for this state. To call that bigotry is ridiculous. That's just unfair and a way to criminalize their speech. I think it's ridiculous. When some random British guy, this is the issue he cares about, some white dude living in Liverpool, why is this your issue? It's not anti-Semitic that it's his issue, but I might be like, maybe he doesn't like Jews. There's a lot of other issues. There's a lot of other injustices he could have picked, and he picked this one. Interesting, that does not make opposition to a political entity the same as bigotry. So to me, they're different. I think anti-Zionism is wokeness, Middle East edition. So it's essentially the inability to distinguish between, a state that has made mistakes and is making mistakes, and, that state having a right to exist. So I think it's stupid. I think it's not for Palestinians. Again, I just want to reiterate that. I respect every Palestinian's right to be anti-Zionist, but if you're just sitting there looking, thinking, is Zionism racism, for example? Does the Jewish state have a right to exist? The pathway that leads to no, I think, is very silly and not really defensible. And is the same one that leads down, to the 1619 Project, where we have to define something as its worst moments, as its worst mistakes. It's the Derridian move. It's the kind of, it's actually logical fallacy. It's the grain of salt fallacy, right? So, how do I know, or the candle fallacy, it's sometimes called, right? You have a candle in a dark room, right? So there's a little bit of light around it. So you can't tell where exactly does the dark start and the light end. It's hard to say, right? There's a range. But what the postmodernist, what Derrida would say is, because we can't tell exactly where light ends and darkness begins, therefore there's no difference between light and dark. That's what difference was basically about. It was saying that if you can't tell exactly where something is, then there's no difference between right and wrong. And I think that's silly, and it's a logical fallacy. We can tell the difference between right and wrong. So people say this all the time to me on Twitter, oh, would you platform Hitler? Would you platform David Duke? It's no, but if you can't tell the difference between a working class person, who voted for Trump because actually he made his life better, and David Duke, you're not a morally serious person. This idea that we don't know the difference between, a state that is perpetuating an unfortunate, unjust, terrible, needs to end occupation, and a state that has no right to exist, that's not morally serious to me. There is an obvious difference between those two things. And I think most of us know that. And I think a lot of people who are less educated, that's very clear to them. What happens when you go to universities now is you learn a bunch of crap, which I know because I have a PhD in crap, literally I have a PhD in nonsense. I mean, you just learn to think your way out of, you can't really get a PhD in the humanities without studying all of this theory, which is why I know it. And it's then you have to unlearn it. How do you unlearn something that's been it's like mother's milk? There's no way to encounter Shakespeare anymore without this stuff. It's not that Shakespeare's that great. What am I talking about? Somebody stop me.
So why isn't Shakespeare?
No. we should the next time we talk. When your book comes out, we'll hopefully have you back, and then we can get into we can drag Shakespeare / defend him.
Is it ready? Is it ready to publish?
It is with the copy editor.
Woo! Congrats.
With the copy editor. What a pleasant moment. Like, no more weight on your shoulders.
No, it's like there was just nothing else to do. Like this pandemic, there was nothing else to do. It was like at some point, like there's just, you can't watch any more TV. You know what I mean? And I was like, guess I'll have to do something,
Well, you can train your cat. You said you have a new one, it sounds like.
Difficult.
And then hopefully we'll all be vaccinated and then you can go outside.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
And I really hope you can join us again.
Thank you so much, you guys. This was such a pleasure. You are both so interesting and so wonderful. It was really, really, really a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcast. We are Uncertain Pod on the social media, and if you're feeling generous, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, if that's your device of choice. Share us with your friends and enemies, and until next time, stay sane.